Okay. So thanks everyone for not just coming, but also not leaving before this session. And it's late. And this talk is going to be a little bit different from the other talks. It's not about grammar per se, but about figurative language or the grammar of poetry. And that's a different kind of grammar. There will be some more, there will be some grammar, but it will look still rather different, okay? And we will be talking, and also let me promise to the non-Indianists in the crowd that although the Indologists have some advantage, they, for the most part, don't know the text, the passage that we're going to read. I think one exception is Marish. So while I will try to also cater for their interests, they are new to this specific passage just as you are, and I will make sure, stop me if there's anything unclear, okay? And what we're going to talk about today is one figure primarily, one ornament of speech called aprastuta prashansa. Please repeat after me. Aprastuta prashansa. Okay. And that means, according to most authorities in the field, we would say there's some discussion about that, praise, prashansa, for what is not relevant to the context, what we're not speaking about, what is aprastuta, not something that, so in some ways, this is similar to allegoria, right? Even the etymology is somewhat similar to allos and agoria. You speak, you will see soon that prashansa doesn't mean necessarily to praise. It can mean to speak in any kind of way about something that is not pertinent to the exact topic, precisely with the purpose of saying something that is pertinent to the topic. But as you will also see, the Greek and Latin allegory and the Sanskrit aprastuta prashansa also went different ways, okay? And in a way, my talk is in itself a kind of a manifestation of aprastuta prashansa. So you will not immediately see what it is doing in a conference or in a school about grammar wars, but I guarantee that there will be a war, that there is some kind of grammar, and moreover, that in the grammar of the grammar war, some statements of harmony and conciliation and agreement will end up being statements of disharmony, contestation, and disagreement, and vice versa. Some statements of belligerent attack will end up being closer than they admit to what they set out to attack. So it's kind of another level of now, aprastuta prashansa, so in Sanskrit poetic theory, there is a whole toolkit of these ornaments, alankara. And the analysis of these ornaments, these figures of speech, the things that ornament the body of poetry, if you will, and their subtypes, is the mainstay of Sanskrit poetic theory, so much so that at a certain point in time, this theory became to be known as the science of ornament, alankara shastra, okay? And aprastuta prashansa, our heroine today, our protagonist today, is one of the older ornaments in the book. It's not from the oldest lists, but it's been there for a while. And I'll give you two quick examples. So when we speak about the allegorical nature of this, So as you can expect, we usually speak about animals or about trees or things like that, like in this nice painting, but we mean other things. So here's an example from the oldest book that we have an example of upper stuta, upper shamsa from, Bhamaha's Ornament of Poetry. I don't give you the Sanskrit for this, just because this is not what I'm interested in for today. This is just to show you the background. Look at the fruits hanging from the trees. They're timely, sweet, offered by the dozens, ready to eat and ready to please. All this without human labor. So, given that this is an example for upper stuta prashansa, we know that the speaker actually doesn't mean to be talking about the fruits hanging on the trees, but about something else. I think the speaker is some courtier or court poet who's not praising the situation of the trees, but complaining about the situation in the palace where he is to beg for his stupid and stingy donor patron to give him his paycheck at the end of every month. Okay, I'm not sure because Bhamaha doesn't explain this example, but in the treatise that follows it, Dandin's Kavya Darsha, the mirror of poetry that was mentioned here a couple of times, does explain his own examples, thank God. And that's exactly what he does. Deer in the forest have it easy. Why? They serve none. There's plenty of water and all sorts of greens just lying there, free for the taking. And that's, I think, a similar idea. And in fact, I think that the name praise, I wrote about I wrote a paper about this many years back. I think the word praise in the name of the figure is a remnant of an older system in which upper stuta prashamsa was a situation where you praise something extraneous to complain about something that's pertinent. But I can't prove that. I just published about it, but I can't prove it, okay? So that's the older system. But by the end of the 11th century, now, and one more question. You might ask yourself, how do we know that the speaker does not intend to speak about deer in the forest and does intend to speak about courtiers at the service of some patron? And this is a question that Sanskrit poetics was increasingly interested in. And in the 9th century, the tradition underwent a revolution of semanticization. It tried to develop semantic theories that explain the different effects of poetry and that ground the different aesthetic effects in different semantic processes. At the crown of this new semantic revolution was what we call resonance or dhwani, this kind of beautiful manifestation, quick, instantaneous manifestation of preferably some kind of emotion, but other things can also resonate in that way through poetry. And this is through the semantic process of suggestion, okay? And there is some suggestion involved here too. There's certainly not, we don't get the court situation from the literal meaning here. It's about deer in the forest. We don't get it from some kind of metaphorical meaning because there's nothing to impede or block the literal meaning as in the classical example of the village on the Ganges, right? It's not on the Ganges, it's on the banks of the Ganges, okay? So there's something that immediately blocks the literal meaning. So there must be some kind of suggestion going on, but this suggestion is not the kind of suggestion that the doyens of this movement crowned as the kind of best part type of poetry. And therefore, a whole lot of these ornaments, these figurative devices, these aesthetic tools had to be curtailed and made sure that they don't kind of overstep their boundaries so that they don't kind of encroach on the domain of dhwani, of resonance. And that happened beginning with the 9th century, okay? So So by the 11th century, when we have this important, really important book called The Light on Poetry, Kavya Prakasha, by Mamata, who tries to create a kind of an overall synthesis of the entire field of poetics, including this new kind of prized feature of suggestion and resonance. These ornaments got special treatment, ornaments like Aprastuta Prashamsa, to make sure that we know exactly what they're doing and not more than what they're doing, okay? And there are 5 agreed upon subtypes in the classical manifestation of Aprastuta Prashamsa. And they have to do with the different kinds of relationships between the literal meaning and the implied meaning. And so it can be likeness, like in the examples we've seen so far. There's something similar between what's happening to the deer and the fruit and what's happening to us in the cows, or dissimilar, actually. These are all examples I kind of pushed aside a little bit. There's a relationship of cause and effect, so we can describe the cause but really mean the effect, and vice versa. And there's a relationship of a universal and a specific. We can describe a universal situation where we really mean a specific case, and vice versa. These are the agreed upon 5 types that Mamata allows for Aprastuta Prashamsa, and that's the classical form. So far, so good. So we're ready to begin our journey.
So you use the effect to talk about the cause, or the cause to talk about
Exactly. So, okay. So now we meet our first hero of tonight, and is my cultural hero when it comes to Indian intellectual history. One of them, his name is Appaya Dikshita. He lived throughout most of the 16th century in South India, and he in the Tamil-speaking region. And he was one of India's most important intellectuals in the 16th century and after. That is to say, once, so Appaya, as I'll call him, he wrote about, he says, 100 books. We only have about a list of, let's say, 50, 60, but that's impressive too, I would say. And he wrote them in all of the different, or almost all of the different disciplines of Sanskrit classical learning. So he was a Sarva Tantra Swatantra, that is to say, he was independent, Swatantra, in each of the tantras, in each of the disciplines. He was, that means really that he was not at home in any one of them and was independent to say whatever he wanted about each and every one of them. And I actually show that this is how he interprets this term. So he was a polyglot and a not a polyglot. He was a polymath, and his books traveled throughout India. And although he was in the periphery, even of the political circles, even in South India, his books very quickly made it to North India, to Benares, which at this time was shaping itself as the intellectual center of India, consciously so. And everybody was reading Appaya, and there was constantly an argument going on. And in each family of scholars and in each lineage of scholars, at least each person has at least one opinion about at least one of Appaya's treatises, but usually more than one. And you can show that with lists of libraries. You can show that with the way his texts were quoted and so on. And in the context of poetics, he didn't write a lot of books, but he wrote this one book that I'll be talking about today that's called the Kulananda, and it's translated as The Joy of the Water Lily. And that's a primer on ornaments that quickly became a bestseller and the #1 primer on poetics between his time and today, and still in many places in India, in traditional settings and even less traditional settings, people start the study of Alankaras by studying the Kulananda. He also wrote other books that I'll mention later in the field of poetics, okay? And here, I don't know if Talia is with us, but this painting is for Talia because we see something that never happened in it. We see Apaya Dikshita to the left, giving his books to his grandnephew and a great scholar and poet in his own right, Nilakanta Dikshita. They never met, but it's a nice story. Okay. So let's right ahead go into Apaya's definition of aprastuta prashansa, praise of the irrelevant, in his Kuvalananda, in his primer of Alankaras. This is Alankara 27. Okay, no particular special place of honor in the book. And he says, praise of the irrelevant is just that, in cases where it is based on the relevant. From among the birds, one is lucky, that which begs none other than Indra. Let's start with the example. This is an example very similar to what we've seen in the older stuff, okay? The one lucky bird is the raindrop cuckoo. The raindrop cuckoo feeds only, supposedly, on rain. And therefore, this bird doesn't need to beg anyone but Indra, the god of rain and storm, right? So that bird is lucky because it only has to ask favors from a very generous and understanding patron who can be trusted. Other birds, like ourselves, for example, are not that lucky, okay? So there's nothing new in particular about this example. And there's also nothing new in the definition, because the definition is lifted with the except of one word from a text that Apaya is basing himself on, which is called the Chandra Aloka, the moonlight or the moon gaze, which is, what is the moonlight? The moonlight is the joy of the water lily. That's what the water lily blooms at night when the moon comes. So there's a special relationship between these texts. And Apaya says, oh, I'm just, adding a few little touches to this older text, nothing special. I'm just taking this existing text. And here, indeed, he's taking the definition. You can see the definition of the Chandraloka on the bottom, and it's almost identical to the definition of the Kuvalananda of the joy. And what is even more interesting, that last word that he changes so that it agrees with Mamata's definition, that Ashreya. So it's like a statement. Look, guys, I'm not going to do anything new about aprastuta prashamsa. And indeed, he says, he goes through the same 5 types that I said that existed, likeness, cause and effect, universal and particular. And then he says, as they say, there are these 5 types. And he quotes a verse that's right from Mamata's Kavya Prakasha. So there you have a statement, explicit statement of agreement, of harmony, of traditionality. Nothing is going to change. Whenever Apaya says that, that he is consciously saying it tongue in cheek. Okay. And now, but the first examples seem still within this kind of allegorical realm of animal stuff that we expect. So here's a verse about the dog and the lion, right? A fake mane curling round its shoulders. Let the dog walk, the lion's walk. Will it roar its roar when thirsty for blood from the towering brow of a rutting elephant? Sorry. So no, it's a rhetorical question. And of course, it's not about a dog putting on a mane, but it's about, Apaya explains, it's about a scholar and a poet who's pretending to be something that he or she isn't, okay? So it's another traditional thing about this, that this comes from a collection that Naresh and I looked at, a collection of allegorical poems in Sanskrit that was already used as a source for illustrations of this very ornament in earlier texts. Not necessarily this ornament, but it was, nothing is new so far. And then Apaya does something interesting. He moves from, he still stays with the realm of, within the realm of similarity still, and within the realm of animal allegorias, but he moves to political discourse, and he gives a couple of examples from a famous classical Sanskrit a work Maga's Shishupalabhada, one of the canonized, the most canonical works in Sanskrit literature. By the way, these are all new translations, and I'm looking for good ideas where I fail. For example, this is a failure, I think. So, moon let a deer land in its lap, earning the name Dodot. I don't think it's a good translation, but if you have a better idea, let me know. Lion treated the fawn beastly. He's king of the beasts. So this is a case actually already of particulars suggesting a universal. The universal that the speaker in this poem is that he's suggesting is, don't be a softie. When you have to fight. Don't be nice to your enemies. Look what happened to the moon. Now, as you know, there's a dot or blot or stain on the moon, right? You know that, right? And it looks sometimes like a rabbit, sometimes like a deer, sometimes like many other things. It's a major topic of fascination in Sanskrit literature, as you will see. But it also kind of, it's a stain. It's a stain. The moon stained itself by embracing, right? By allowing the mriga to sit in its lap. So, and whereas when the lion behaved in this kind of beastly way, he became king of beasts. Okay, so still we're sampling with a little different register of poetry. This is kind of political oratory, but still nothing changes. But here's something interesting that happens at this point. Once Apaya is into the moon, he goes over the moon, and and this is something that in a forthcoming paper that Naresh and I wrote, we're talking about in a related text, but it's also true of Apaya's text, how these kinds of texts compose themselves by a train of association. So here's a verse that all the Sanskritists in the room should know, okay? And this is a verse from another highly canonical Sanskrit poem, the Naishadhya, by Sri Harsha. And this is a verse that goes as follows. Brahma must have mined the moon to mold the face of Damayanti. You can see the dark blue on the far side, straight through the bottomless pit. So here's a different take on the moon. That dark spot on the moon, it's not a spot, it's a crater, it's a pit, it's a hole in the moon. There's a hole in the moon. It looks dark because you can see the darkness on the other side. Why is there a hole in the moon? Well, look at Damayanti on the right side, with that most beautiful woman in India, or one of them anyhow. And how does she have such a beautiful moon? Well, a lot of moon material had to be mined to create that beautiful face, and that's how that moon got to get a hole. So this is an example of a cause used to speak of an effect. But here's something strange. Nobody in the history of Sanskrit Alankara Shastra would have ever thought about this verse as aprastuta prashansa. It's not exactly what we've seen so far. This is an example of talking about, it's clearly an example of utpreksha, of seeing something, imagining something, right? There's this dot in the moon. Why is there this dot in the moon? Well, Brahma and so on. But we're beginning to sense something different taking place. If this is a prastuta prashansa, then every case where we are talking about the standard of comparison in a little bit more detail than the usual is also a case of aprastuta prashansa.
Someone says this is a prastuta prashansa?
Apaya says.
Apaya says it.
Apaya is the first to say that, as far as I know. If you look in the commentaries on the Naishadiyya, they would say it's a friction.
Because it's a direct reference to the face of Damayanti. So
Yeah.
it is very much pressed to that.
Yeah, it's very strange.
Yeah.
It's totally, I mean, it's totally unexpected in this context. Okay. And then come, so up to now, all the verses that we have seen are really from canonical Sanskrit sources. But now Abhaya turns within, still with this theme of the moon. He turns to a poet who's never before been anthologized in Sanskrit texts and poetics. I can assure you that, because that poet is him. And it's from a poem that he was writing exactly at the same time, or around the same decade anyhow, that he was writing his joy, okay? And this is from a poem called the Varadaraja Stava, and that's a praise hymn for God Vishnu in his manifestation as Varadaraja in Varadaraja Koil in Kanchipur, okay? And this is, by the way, interesting thing, this is a hymn to Vishnu by a follower of Shiva. Interesting stuff going on, okay? Now, this is it's a complicated poem, okay? The elixir of life for rays, body waning, moons fall at your feet, surely eyeing a toehold in God. Handing over their charm, their store of merit to a friend, your face, they start for the sun, month by month. Okay, I won't explain the whole verse now, but there is a similar cause and effect. Varadaraja, Vishnu, in his manifestation in Kanchi, has a beautiful face because moons have left their store of merit, which is their beauty, their charm, to eat at his feet. Okay? This is a cause and effect. So far, so good. Now, we don't have to analyze this because Appaya does it at some length. After a brief explanation, he says the following. I read it to you. Here is a more detailed account of the verse, of this verse. The moon, to begin with, is depicted as if it is different every month, either as the result of some mantra. So maybe the moon has a kind of a rejuvenating mantra that it utters every month, or because we determine a difference despite there being non-difference based on the cycle of waxing and waning. So it's the same moon, but we imagine it to be a new moon every month, right? We use the word new moon, right? So already here we have two alankaras for the Sanskritist. We have Utpriksha, this using of the mantra by the moon, and Atishayokti, the imagining of difference given non-difference. Anyhow, now here, since time is beginningless, past moons are countless billions. So right, there must be a lot, especially towards the end. And altogether, all moons find footing in heaven, which we determine to be an act of falling to God's foot, because based on the power of the spun here, so another ornament, Shlesha, because the foot of God is also heaven, okay? And those falling at God's feet, when their bodies wane, eye the ultimate position, or toehold. And it is at that very moment that they deposit their store of merit with their friends and enter the realm of the sun. So much is established in the scriptures, and it is in accordance with this that the poet, he speaks of himself in the third person, it posits the moon's waning, which happens on the darkest night of the month, and their entry into the sun, turns the abandoning of their formerly evident charm, here identified as their store of merit, into a cause, and imagines it through seeing as a gift to God's face, whose friendship with the moon is figuratively established on the basis of resemblance. So another ornament in Sanskrit, when you say that X is a friend of Y, it can be a simile. And now he gets into this scriptural issue. True, No, sorry, not yet. He says, true, if one hands one's marriage over to one's many friends, each friend stands to gain alone. But in the verse, the word friend is used in the singular, implying that the moons of God's face are their only friend. Thus, the ornament distinction is also suggested here, since no other face has the faintest whiff of resemblance with the moon. God's face is far superior to all others. Look at this. This takes the idea of mining a bit of the moon to make the Humanities face. Now we have billions and billions and billions of beginningless numbers of moons who all donated their charm to create the God's face. Okay, now comes a kind of a scriptural question. Note that although the scriptures enjoin the transference of the moon of one's married to friends only after at some point, and there's another scripture, the Sharirika Shastra, which established the opposite. Okay, but we get the point. Okay, so now note we're in a very different place where we started. It's a very complicated verse with a great deal of figurative, imaginative, and hypothetical elements. It's a kind of a magnified irrealis that that begins with the subject, with the object of comparison, or the standard of comparison with the moon, and ends with the incomparability of the face, the subject of comparison. All this complicated stuff Abhaya unpacks for us. And this is, nobody would have dealt with these verses, first of all, and with these kinds of verses while dealing with upper stuta prashams. And we've just begun. This is just going to get way more complicated. Okay, so now, and I'm skipping. I'm not giving you the whole text, believe me. Okay, I'm skipping some verses. Now you get this verse. So we're back to animals. Okay, sigh of relief. Moon is over. I mean, I didn't read you all the moon verses, but we're back to the animal kingdom, and we're talking about some beautiful woman. Easy topic. If they see her saunter, geese will swallow their pride. A word with her, and cuckoos would vow silence. Near her supple body, jasmine is all but stone. Need I say more of her charm? Let Lakshmi put on sackcloth and ashes. So this is a woman who is beyond the standard, the highest standard of beauty, goddess Lakshmi, the radiant and beautiful goddess. And of course, all the other standards would have to be ashamed of herself somehow if they saw her. Okay, so Abhaya says, here the heroine's aspects such as a saunter are context relevant, right? Why are they context relevant? Because this beautiful woman is the person we're describing, okay? But they are spelled out through their imagined proper effects, such as the geese swallowing their pride. Unlike it, now here's a distinction. Unlike in the previous, Abhaya likes to do that. He likes to show you he likes to show the students. It's a didactic move. What's the difference between examples? Unlike in the previous example, the effects are not actual. That is to say, not actual as imagined. That is to say, the moons have not really become the face of the moon, but it is imagined as actual. Okay? It is imagined as something that happened. Here, what is imagined is something hypothetical. If it's contingent, right? If the geese will see her, they will swallow their pride. If the group, so it's another level of irrealis that's built into this distinction, that's built into this simile that somehow now also classified as upper stuta prashams. Okay. Now another example. If all animals could be body shamed, then the yaks, beholding that bun of hair of the mountain king's daughter. So we had enough of Vishnu's family. Now we're back to Shiva's family. That's Parvati. Okay. So if all animals could be body shamed, then the yaks, beholding that bun of hair of the mountain king's daughter, will care no more for their ponytails. So the tails of the yaks are supposed to be really beautiful with their kind of hairy fluff, whatever it is there. And that's usually standard of comparison for the hair of beautiful hair of a woman. But in this case, if animals could be body shamed, and if they beheld the abundance of the hair of the non-king's daughter, they would care no more. They would, yeah, they would basically become self-conscious, I guess. And now, but if you think that this is complicated, Abhinav wants to come back to his previous example, okay? And he says, look at this previous example. There's this third line, which we didn't touch upon, okay? And he says, however, in the third line of the previous example, even the effect of observing the extraordinary suppleness of her limbs that form the topic of description does not mean that a censured jasmine is hard. After all, its hardness relative to the counterpart is not some effect that can occur, but it's merely a realization about it on our part. So this is a kind of a meta irreality. If the jasmine stood next to that beautiful woman, then the jasmine would be, then we would think jasmine is stunning. Okay. Now,
Is this your paragraph or Appaya's side?
it's up there. Everything you see is up there. Yeah. So, yeah, I didn't put the prose, but it's here. Now you begin to see that these things go a little bit further away, far afield from where we started. And Appaya comes to this question. He says, when the effect is nothing but our realization of something as if it is an effect, it does not in any way diminish the fact that the ornament is based on an effect. So it's still, what he's saying is, and he adds, and the ancients have indeed illustrated such instances under praise of the irrelevant that is based on an effect. So he's still saying, look, guys, this is nothing new. I'm still within the 5 categories of aprastuta prashamsa. Okay.
What's the word for realization?
Pratiti or buddhi or something. Tad buddhi.
Okay.
Okay. So Gary, what's the next phrase in the text? Vastutastu.
Oh,
So here Appaya switches gears, and Gary and I once wrote an article on this phrase, vastutastu, but really, even if these cases go beyond being based on an effect, there's nothing wrong. Okay, so it could be explained under the matrix of these 5 subtypes, but really, why stick to these 5 subtypes? Who said we need to have just 5 subtypes? It is impossible to limit the relationships between the relevant and irrelevant entities in praise of the irrelevant to just 5, and other relationships can be demonstrated for this ornament, right? Here's another verse that I composed. I mean, he doesn't say that he composed it, but we know he did. Like heaps of chaff, unhusked and scattered by the breeze you breathe from your smile, the one healing herb for the 3 types of heat. These rays of the moon roam the world. This is a complicated image. I won't go into it, but the point here is that the moonbeams that are not relevant to the context, we're talking about Vishnu, not about the moon. The moonbeams that are context irrelevant are imagined as heaps of chaff coming from a certain special grain, so to speak, the divine hidden herb that is God's gentle smile. And it is still Appaya speaking in his own voice, and it is thanks to this seeing as, this ornament of seeing as, then an indescribable quality is suggested, namely that God's gentle smile is their wheat. Now, it is not the case that wheat and chaff are in a relationship of cause and effect, or one of the other 4 relationships enumerated before might. And we thus must resort to an additional relationship here, such as entities that are co-produced, right? the wheat and the chaff are co-produced. One doesn't produce the other. They're not similar to one another. They're not as specific and universal. It's something else. And there are other things. I won't run you through this whole thing. Okay. So, and at this point, Apaya does something even worse. He coins a new one. Now that he kind of broke the rules of the existing subtypes of Prastuta Prashansa, he coins a new ornament called the offshoot of the relevant. No such coin has ever existed in Sanskrit poetic theory. And this Prastuta Ankura, sorry, a K is missing there. Prastuta Ankura is, and this is a verse for Sivan here. So offshoot of the relevant is when one relevant topic reveals another. Maybe when the jasmine is present, why bother with a thorny ketaki? I know that this thorn is not the ketaki, but I like the image of this thorn. So we have a triangle, right? We have a triangle, love triangle of the bee, the fragrant, beautiful jasmine, and this kind of not very inviting ketaki, not depicted here, I know. And of course, the as Apaya explains, where one relevant topic that is being described reveals another relevant topic that is intended. This is the ornament offshoot of the relevant. The second half of the above verse is an example of this ornament, where here the speaker is a woman who is strolling in the garden with her partner, her male partner. And her speech is addressed to a bee she spots. She sees a bee. She talks to the bee, okay? So the literal meaning is certainly relevant to the context. The bee is there. And don't say that the literal meaning here is irrelevant by virtue of being impossible and so far. Yeah, impossible. Give me a break. I'm only interested in the impossible. And so far as the bee is being addressed, and one would never address the bee. So the literal meaning could only serve to facilitate the understanding of the meaning that is truly relevant. Don't say that. This is wrong. Because in the word, we do observe cases where people address bees.
So this is the reason why this is not a Prastuta Prashansa, because
The bee is Prastuta. The bee is Prastuta. The bee is Prastuta. It's in the context. It's there. She is talking to a real bee standing on a real molecule. Okay.
But it's not a Prastuta Prashansa because it's Prastuta Ankura.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, so I'm asking.
Yeah.
The reason it's not a
Yeah. Because the bee and the jasmine and the ketaki are all Prastuta. They're all there. They're all there just in front of her. They're not the real intent, but they're relevant. Okay. Now, why is this? Okay, we'll get to this in a second. Okay, but just to give you some more bees and some more examples. Okay. So that example, that previous example was, this was a textbook example. It's part of his definition. But now, just like as he did with the moon, now is the turn of the bees. Okay. So, yeah, turn your greedy gaze, bee, to other vines whose blossom can withstand the grinding. In vain you give pain to this jasmine bud, still awaiting its period. For the Sanskrit, you will see that there is a pun here in Rajasan, right, which means both pollen and menstruation. So I try to capture it in that translation. So it's very clear. Again, it's the same situation basically, but this is a kind of a predator male who is harassing a younger girl, and this somebody else, probably another woman, is saying, like, give her a break. What are you doing? You're married. You have your jasmine bud. You have these other blossoms that can withstand the grinding. Why are you? You have your ketaki. I don't know. Anyhow, so it's the same situation, and many more such examples are given. But again, the bee is there. The bee is being addressed. Okay. Another.
What's the difference between this and a Samasukti?
Good. So an important question. Abhaya is taking this straight from Dundon's example of Samasokti, another figure called condensed speech, but I won't get into this right now. It's important. Here's another nice example, okay? This lotus props up a pair of flower cups bitten by the beak of a gander. And the new shoot on the mango vine was savored by the cuckoo. Hearing your friends at the poolside chatter in this way, the lady quickly covered the slopes of her breasts with the end of her scarf and her lip with her palm. So there are a bunch of women at the pool, and they're kind of gossiping about their friend or talking in a way that she can overhear. And the point is that there are signs of love on her body, but they talk about this lotus. They're using the deiktik, right? They're talking about, they're using idam and so forth, right? Iyam, kosha dvandvam iyam, and so on. And iyam nalini, kosha dvandvam dadat. Okay, so they're pointing at something that's there. So she gets the point and she covers the relevant parts, but this is again, an instance of this new ornament where something contextual suggests another content. Now, why is this so important? Okay, because this is going back at suggestion. This is going back at resonance and reappropriating, theoretically reappropriating. This is grammar wars. This is going to the old schema, the classical schema, and saying what these people called Dwani is really what I'm calling this Alankara. It's Alankara land. It's not part of Dwani. Okay, he says, now Abhinavagupta, the author of the Eye, that's the most important commentary of Ananda Vardhan's Dwani book, has labeled the first pair of examples given above as resonance based on some other excuse. He said, actually, he never said this, this quote is not traceable. He said, but it's capturing the idea, I think. In praise of the irrelevant, the literal meaning is not context relevant and hence not the thing to be described. In the case of praise of the irrelevant, because the process of literal signification does not reach completion, it leads to the ornament of manifesting the meaning that is context relevant. Here, on the other hand, since the literal meaning is context relevant, the literal signification reaches completion. We understand that somebody's talking about bees and about jasmines and about lotuses, who are all there. But we do get some other thing. And this is supposed to be resonance. But really, if you go back to the bottom, but really, here too, there's only an ornament, not resonance. As I explained in my other book, and he didn't get to write that piece of that other book, so we don't get the full explanation, okay? That other book, Chitramimamsa, is left incomplete, and the part about Aprastuta Prashansa is not written. So he was writing these two books at the same time, but this was finished, the other one was left unfinished.
But in that last verse, the lotus and the mango vine are not really relevant because they're not there.
They're
Is
there.
it just the iyam that makes them?
Yes, yes, he explains that. Yeah,
No.
they're there. They're there. The whole point is that they're, so that allows the other women to save face and speak about this as if they're speaking about these things that are really there.
So there really is a lotus there.
Yes, exactly. That's bitten by, yeah,
But she realizes they're talking.
yes.
Okay.
That's what lies behind this, the distinction between this and the classical approach.
Yes. So we went a long way, actually. We went a long way. And what we did is we pretended not to do anything with Aprastuta Prashansas that is new. Defined it in the own language, gave a traditional example, committed to the typology of 5 subtypes. And then we gradually expanded this typology until we created an entirely new typology of Aprastuta Ankara that appropriates a whole lot of cases that were classified earlier as Dwani. Okay, now we get to meet our new protagonist in the story. It's not him. This is, where's Pat? This is Shah Jahan, right? But Jagannatha, our second character here, 17th century, born at the end of the 16th century in Andhra, immigrated to the north, and he was the king of Pandits at the Mughal court of Shah Jahan. And he was a different, so that's Shah Jahan. I don't have an image of any sort of Jagannatha. And he was a very different guy. For example, he wrote the poem called the Bhamini Vilasa, which Mayan worked on, and that is perhaps love poetry to his Muslim beloved. There is actually, this is one story that actually seems to be true from all the stories that surround these people. And he also wrote a huge book on poetics, part of which I have here, called the Rasa Ganga, that I didn't want to slip the other volume also, and from which we're going to sample briefly. And he also wrote, or didn't write it, but he extracted from that book all these attacks on Appaya's Chitramimamsa, this incomplete magnum opus, and published them separately as the Chitramimamsa Khandana, the demolition of the Chitramimamsa. Okay, so you can already see that whatever Jagannatha is thinking, Appaya is in the back of his mind. Okay, so I'll take a few minutes to briefly run through his response to Aprastuta Prashansa. Okay. Now, he defines, I don't give you the definition, it's a traditional definition of Aprastuta Prashansa, the same 5 types we've already seen. I'll give you some of the examples. First of all of his examples, or almost all of his examples, are his. He writes them, and it's not like in Appaya's case that he borrows from his own. It's usually written for this purpose, so for pedagogical purposes. So he not only doesn't curate them, he knows exactly what he's writing, okay? And so my hunch is that some of these Aprastuta Prashansas are really about Appaya Dikshita himself. I can't prove this, but that's my hunch. So it's a kind of another level of Aprastuta Prashansa. So for example, when it plays in the water, the sound of swelling waves as the Lord of all cardinal directions believe that the ocean is charming it. When it opens its mouth, curious for their taste, schools of tall Timingala fish get swallowed. But in whose belly will this Leviathan end up when it feels the urge to enjoy itself outside the ocean? So we're talking about this big fish, who's maybe not so big as it thinks, and maybe will be in the belly of some other fish someday. And that resonates with one of the opening verses of the Rasa Ganga. I won't get into this, but I think it's an interesting one. Raghava is the name of a big fish here. It's not the name of Rama. Okay. Okay, Charlie asked me about Samasokan. Here, I won't read this text. It's a lot of text here, but there are 3 important things that I want to make a point of allude to here quickly. Jagannatha says that this is not condensed speech. Okay, this is not this other ornament called condensed speech. The untechnical grounds that I won't get into it. And that's important because he knows that the Prastuta Ankura example that Appaya gives is lifted from Dandin's example of condensed speech. That's one. So he's already, from the very start, he's thinking of Appaya. Secondly, he is saying that Mamata, in his own discussion of this, got it wrong. And thirdly, he said, well, maybe he didn't get it wrong, but we'll have to, he didn't mean what he said. So here too, we have this kind of interesting negotiation between respect to the most, by then, the most authoritative text of the tradition on ornaments. And he doesn't say, well, okay, forget the classification of Mamata, but he says, well, but we'll have to find a way of, maybe he didn't mean what he said. We'll move. I mean, I can speak for about 2 more hours about this discussion. It's a long discussion. I won't do this. I give very few examples, but here's something interesting. You would think that what Jagannatha would do is just like bring everything back to where it was. Hey, Apaya, there are only 5 subtypes, and there's only what we come to speak of when we speak of Aprastuta Prashansa. But instead, it's more complicated stuff, and B is all over, right? So he says, thus far, at some point in the conversation, I spoke a phrase of the irrelevant based on likeness. That's the first time. In some cases, the literal meaning of the sentence stands entirely independent from the implied meaning, as we have seen in the examples thus far. But in other cases, it relies on identity with the implied meaning to establish a suitable connection. So here's a theory of allegory that I don't think that was developed in any place in human history. It's a theory of all kinds of dependencies between the literal meaning and the allegorical meaning. So in some cases, they're independent. You speak about birds and you mean, or dogs, and you mean lousy poets, okay? But in some cases, the literal meaning needs the allegorical meaning to be understood. And as he will show later, I won't get into this, vice versa. Sometimes the allegorical meaning depends on something in the literal meaning. So they're bleeding into one another. That's a sophisticated analysis of allegory that I don't know from any other place. And it also shows you that both him and Apaya are using alankaras as a way of reading new texts and of new verses. Okay, so these examples are invented examples, but it's a new method of reading and writing poetry. It's not just typology. It's not just empty typology. So, hey, wild jasmine, don't spurn the bee. Now he's turning this around. It's not the bee that's spurning the jasmine, but the jasmine that's spurning the bee. Of course, all of this is always intended. All these digs and jabs are always intended. Hey, wild jasmine, don't spurn the bee coming to you through a stroke of flood. He relishes the taste of lotuses. You know, you're not the only one, brimming with pollen. While you dial your days away, cuckoo. So while your dull days away, cuckoo, in this godforsaken forest, until you spot that one mango tree, all bees above. So what's common to these two verses? Somebody's addressing this bird or this bee or this flower. They're there, just like in Apaya's examples of the Prastuta Ankura. So you see he's already trying to bring them back into the fold of Aprastuta Prashansa. But it's not the same Aprastuta Prashansa anymore. It's already a revised Aprastuta Prashansa that takes into consideration something that he must admit Apaya saw. Apaya saw a situation wherein the literal meaning is sometimes more context relevant than we think. So he's taking this into account in his new theory of Apaya. So although he's arguing, as you will see, with Apaya, and I won't go through all of this, and I want to see that. I want to just read this verse, okay? Some fool tied a necklace round the monkey's neck, licking it, sniffing it, rolling it up. He holds his hair high, right? You give something precious. He explains here through the irrelevant account of the monkey, the context relevant to universal. So this is from a specific universal. It suggests that maybe that giving a beautiful object to those who cannot appreciate it leads to their loss. I think he's thinking about Apaya Dikshita. You gave that Apaya Dikshita, this really precious system of alankaras, necklaces and alankara. And this monkey, or as he calls them in other texts, the Dravida Pungava, the bull of the Tamilians, yeah. He's destroying their system, as he says himself. So he says, but really, okay, no, let's skip this. So at the middle of his discussion, he says, with this, we've done away with the view of with the Joyce author. That's how he calls it. Okay. And those who follow him. So by this time, Apaya is not alone in the 17th century. Namely, that what both meanings are context relevant, this results in a separate ornament called offshoot of the relevant. If every minute difference would lead us to coin a new ornament. So there is a difference. He realizes this difference. He builds this difference into his new theory. But no, don't coin a new ornament. If every minute difference is going to lead to the coining of a new ornament, then given the infinity of the nuances of expressivity, the problem of having infinite ornaments will become immediately manifest. Here's how to understand it. So, and he gives his own explanation. In cases where an entirely irrelevant meaning is literally expressed, the primary semantic operation, denotation, does not come to rest in it, and it forcefully draws out the suggested meaning. So there is no scope for overlap with the resonance. But when the two meanings are context relevant, which he admits happens in poetry, there can be no denial of resonance. In this way, the variety of praise for the irrelevant that is rooted in likeness is twofold. So he accepts a subclassification of this subcategory of likeness is twofold. As for the four other varieties, however, they are nothing but type. Okay, we won't get into this. We won't get into it. So I'll stop here. There's much more going on there. There's much more. In fact, he changes the name of the ornament himself. He says, aprostuta prashansa is not praise of the irrelevant, but praise by means of the irrelevant. It's very important for him to. Anyhow, I won't get into this, and there's much more going on, but I think I'll summarize by saying, okay, so we have warring factions here, I think, and they have their own kind of grammar of poetry in a new world where things are changing, poetic taste is changing, political order is changing, and they bitterly fight on what seems to be a meaningless kind of classification, like should we have 5 subtypes or more than 5 subtypes? Should we coin a one small new ornament or not? But really, it's on the one hand, it's the stability of the whole theory as received by Jagannatha and his monkey friend, as I think he thinks of him. That is at stake on the one hand. But on the other hand, what's common to both of them, I think, is much more than initially meets the eye. And they share a lot of the new sensibilities. Okay, so that's
Remind me of something in Chinese poets. It's not exactly the same when you attempt to make that claim, but it resonates in my mind. There's a set of 3 terms of classical Chinese poets, which sometimes you might call them 3 modes of expression from tropes, but which 2 are just obvious. One is direct description, and one is simile metaphor. Third one is interesting. The word, something like a rising of feeling or rising of attention or something like that. First of all, they're probably musical terms to begin with, but we don't worry about that. And this is often applied to poems, usually in really very early poetry, but they show up in later poetics too. Usually cases where you start with an image for almost like a full half of the poem, at least. You start with an image which is developed to a certain amount, and you start feeling it, and then it just drops it. It goes on to what it really wants to talk about. It's really irrelevant. Once in a while, you can see it as a kind of metaphor, or you can see it as a kind of description, context-related thing that goes together. Very often, no.
Mm-hmm.
And then you feel a little bit like struck a chord with me.
So one thing that's interesting in the comparison is the way I think that Appaya is trying to turn this into a major vector of the way he reads poetry. Every description that is slightly irrelevant, slightly more than the normal irrelevant to the topic is already has this tinge of upper stupa prashansa, which it's very striking to me. I've never seen anything like that before him. So poetry, so these ornaments are not like limited tools, but they're kind of forces of creation and analysis and reading. The readerly and writerly prisms for our negotiation of poetry, and they're all co-involved, but this one becomes really big and important for because of all of these imaginative and realist things that are going on that I thought you would find interesting.
I do.
Can I add to something? Just add a footnote to what Andy is saying. So the third principle that Andy described earlier, this idea of seeing that means, as he said, arises. The reason why I think it becomes so dominant or such a topic of discussion is because unlike description or metaphorical comparison, it is linked to the process of poetic creation, because you hear this bird cry and then the poem's about something else, and the interpreter would say, but he really did hear that bird cry, and then it makes him think of X, Y, Z, right? So there's something intrinsically more mystical almost, because it's connected to the act of creation itself, I think, not just an act of interpretation.
When I teach this subject in classes, when I was a teacher, I would tell the students, the definition of this category is non-metaphor. In other words, you read the poem, you think the first part must be some kind of metaphor, some kind of hidden metaphor from the rest, and then you must slap your own face and say, no, it's not that. And leave it at that.
But it's the irrelevance or unexpectedness that actually becomes the driving force, right? That kind of course, it makes the interpreter work even harder.
Yeah, what's interesting here is that, so in the examples with which we begin, there is a very standard regularity to them. You know exactly what to expect. But in these more complicated examples, there are things going on that are unexpected. As I said, the irrelevant and the irrelevant bleed into one another, and they become far more convoluted, complicated with meta imaginative levels that go well beyond these kind of, talking about the birds and talking about the bees.
So again, it resonates for me, although it is not quite the same thing. But the Roman orators discussed in their vast rhetorical tracts, how do you deal with when you want to mention something that will help your case, but it's not actually relevant?
Right,
And the answer is, you say, this is not relevant.
Right.
I'm not going to mention it.
right.
So it's called praeteritio. I'm going past it. So my client, he fought nobly on behalf of the country, but I won't mention that. It's not
Yes.
relevant. The other guy, he ran away in battle, but I won't mention that. It's not relevant.
We have a special ornament for that in Alan. That's different. That is akshepa. Akshepa can be of something said or unsaid, of the past, present, or the future, and of many other things. And it's just like, I won't go there. Yeah. Yes.
I have a question on the motives behind Jagannatha's so frequently calling up the Dikshita various kinds of animals.
He's not calling him here, right?
Well, here
Yeah,
he suggests that he's a monkey,
I think so.
but the context is that that the monkey is mishandling something
Right,
precious. In other words, Abhaya is monkeying with the system.
exactly.
And
Exactly.
when he calls him a bull,
Yeah,
it's clear in this setting
yeah. There's a
That
bull in the China.
he's a
shop.
bull in the china shop, that
Yeah.
he's trashing
Yeah,
the system.
yeah.
And he says elsewhere, well, even here, he says, so, we know, Mama just said there are 5 types.
Right.
So let's not have any funny business. There are 5
Right.
types. Although he has his own new ways of
Right.
explaining it. But so you would think that that's the reason for all of this, that
Right.
it's his kind of conservative
Right.
view. But then there are these other things, like where he says, you think you're a big fish.
Yeah.
You're not the big fish in the pond, where the motive seems to be one of rivalry instead.
Right.
right? But my question there is, if he also has a motive of rivalry or disgruntlement at the success of Apaya, who came sometime
No
before
doubt in
him.
my mind. No
But
doubt.
then, but if that's
He's kind
true,
of annoyed with this. I think he's kind of annoyed with this provincial guy who's making such a name for himself without even setting foot in Delhi and Benares. Oh, I didn't show you
But-
one. Really
but
nice
it
poem.
depends my
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
If he also has that motive, how could he possibly have missed a chance to refer to Apaya as a dog with a fake mane title?
That was already taken.
And then Joseph.
So,
I have a question that in terms of, for example, somebody like us who's reading it in these times or maybe a few centuries ago, we would still get at the intended meaning without even thinking of that this is an offshoot of what rest of them. So I don't see I mean, the necessity to come. I mean, I don't know. I that we can do without that, the new ornament, and we still get the meaning of the intended meaning of the words and still appreciate it.
well, the question, when you say we will get the meaning, you mean that you will have some kind of an aesthetic experience. The question is this kind of aesthetic effect sufficiently well explained with one of our theoretical concepts? Or do we need a new theory? Now, so that's one motivation. The other motivation is that there are these two systems, the older system, Dandin system, to which Apaya is far more committed, and this new Dwani system to which Apaya is really very much opposed. So if you find an example that not only calls for a new theory, but is a good test case to show for him in his mind that the Dwani theory can't explain it, and you can reclaim land from Dwani land into Alankara land. That's very useful for him, and he does it throughout the book. It's not an only example.
It's not an only example with other Alankaras that
Yes,
take the one concept
yes,
into
many other Alankaras
innovative.
that are either reconfigured or coined. Yeah, so he has 100 alankaras in this book, and not all of them are. See, and it's a book that is just putting some new touches on this old book, okay? But really, it's doing a lot of new stuff. Yeah.
And just in these new Alankaras or these old Alankaras, usually there are his own persons.
For Apaya?
Coming with his own. Yeah.
No, it's usually, no, it's a good question. So Apaya is what Naraj and I call, is a very good curator
Yeah.
of anthologizer. He's very good at picking poems from different periods and different sources. Some of them come from the classical canonical Mahakavyas. Some of them come from more contemporaneous sources. Some of them come from the Subhashita anthology. Some of them come from earlier textbook examples or Alankara books. And some of them are from, very few of them, but in this section 3, come from his Varadaraja stuff. So that's,
Yeah.
that-
So that's an inclination.
no, it's not an inclination, but this is a poem he wrote in what I call his Alankara period. And I think he wrote it pretty much at the same time. And you see that when he was writing the poem, he was thinking about this Alankara. And then when he was writing about Alankara, he was thinking about this poem.
I think
Sarah
Joseph
has
had a question. Oh, Sarah.
I don't know if I understood a lot, but let me share my misunderstandings. And that is kind of what I perceived is that there is also war going on between the relevant and the irrelevant. And this kind of corresponds to the relation between poetry and poetics. And the question is, what is the relevant and the irrelevant in this relation? And if when you go to Jagannatha, then it seems to be a problem of mapping. And it reminded me actually of the beautiful Borges story, of course, that tries to map out that as a country that has specialists in map making. They try to map out the land and they end up having a map that is as big as their country itself. And I think somehow this paradox underlies his.
You could say that Jagannatha is the Borgesian author, right? In this case, because what he's blaming Apaya off is like, you will have as many ornaments as there are verses. That's a kind of a one-to-one map of the work. But it's not a fair accusation because he only has 100 ornaments. And also because so what? You know, let's have more ornaments. I mean, it's if we need them, we'll coin them. This is a tension that runs through the tradition from its inception. Some more conservative writers say, no, it's just this set of ornaments and whatever you need, you can explain to them. And some of them even try to reduce the number of ornaments. And some of them say, like London, they say no. Ornaments are being I'm giving you the kind of the key core, but ornaments are infinite and they're being coined as we speak. And there are as many styles as there are poets, and everything is kind of open-ended because this is the human domain. So about the first thing, about the relationship between the relevant and the irrelevant, I'll have to think about it a little bit more. I like the idea that they're also in more. But I think more basically, the question is, how do you get from one to the other? And how do they map onto one another? The basic classical conception of Aprastuta Prashamsa is you have 5 types, and these explain the only 5 relationships from which you can travel from an irrelevant, context irrelevant depiction to the intended relevant depiction. One is one thing is like another, and one is the cause and the other the effect. And what Apaya is trying to say, the world doesn't work that way. The relationships between what is relevant and intended and what is irrelevant and spoken of are way more, are myriad. And the two are not also clearly and neatly separated from another. And the amazing thing is that Jagannatha agrees with it. That's almost the most amazing thing about this discussion. That is my answer. I don't think it's a good answer, but that's my answer.
So I'm not sure if that so what I understood is trying to somehow appropriate it. So I was wondering if you don't what does it do with the Samasokti? Why? Because when you do the Antura Prashamsa, it's still some way categorized under because it's named the same. So why not create a category altogether that puts all these definitions, Samasokti and Prashamsa, on all these categories on the new one?
That's a good question. I think the point is, I can't give you a good answer about what he's doing with Samasokti because I don't remember off the top of my head. I'll have to read again. It's a big book. But on the whole, I think the tendency in Sanskrit and Indic poetic theories is to retain the specificity of different flavors, here spoken of metaphorically, of different kinds of aesthetic effects. Each thing has its own vichitti vishesha, its specific twist, its specific kind of contours. And if we call all of them irony or all of them allegory or all of them what have you, then we lose that. Nobody wants to lose that. Anandavardhana doesn't want to lose that. Jagannatha Panditaraja doesn't want to lose that. Apaya doesn't want to lose that. it's somehow ingrained into the education and sensitivity and sensibilities of a sensitive reader of this kind of poetry. And overriding theories will lose that specificity of the reaction and the no, like when a reader reads a verse like the ones we began, and any Sanskrit competent reader, he knows or she knows immediately that this is upper Stuta Prashants. When they read the verse about Damayanti and the moon, Hrittasara, right? They don't think that. And so what Apaya is trying is to use the theory for new ways of analyzing poetry. This is something we're told that Alankara Shastra doesn't do, but I think it does. So, but hardly anyone, let's put it this way, hardly anyone wants to collapse all these similar categories. That's what's keeping the tradition alive and going, is how to make sure that we can maintain all our different categories and still have a coherent system and still have good criteria to differentiate one from the other and to validate what we know is different. That's what our aesthetic judgment, the aesthetic judgment of the Sahridaya, of the connoisseur, is what is at the heart of the system. And the Sahridaya knows that this is something different, slightly different from this. And the system wants to be able to reflect and defend this thing.
I think Joseph has a question, and there's a question there. Yeah.
So this is another one of my questions about the left field. It doesn't have literature at all. And I'm coming from working philosophy of language on metaphor. And I mean, they're interesting points of contact. So I just want to ask you. So for a long time in Anglo-American philosophy of language, the assumption was that an utterance will be recognized as metaphorical, that it's metaphorical, just in case there's something internally grammatically deviant about it. It's outrageously false, or there's something wrong syntactically, grammatically. And now work has shifted away from this idea that there's going to be something grammatically deviant about the metaphorical utterance. It can be perfectly true, literally, right? And you look at the context. And it's an inappropriateness and uninformativeness, right, in the context. So one question is whether or not was there a prior theory according to which metaphors had to be, for an utterance or line to be recognized as metaphorical?
One of the world's most sophisticated theories of metaphor.
Pardon?
One of the world's most sophisticated theories of metaphors, how metaphors work, a very detailed classification of different kinds of metaphors pre-existed all of this.
But did they use the criteria for recognizing that utterance to be metaphorical to be that it had to be somehow literally impossible?
That it had to be interpreted literally. It had to be blocked and redirected. That's the language that they use. So signification had to be blocked and redirected to its secondaries.
And did the blocking have to be on the basis of something internal to the utterance, or did it look to its context?
It had to be something logically internal.
So this is I mean, if you look at the two shifts between your theory and the West, I mean, those are very similar shifts, away from something logical or internal in some sense to, looking at it in its context. Okay. The second point was that, you in the West, so we distinguish very clearly between recognizing that an utterance is metaphor, right? And determining what its metaphorical interpretation is, what the content is. And in both cases, I would argue, it's very highly context dependent, in different ways. But to recognize that an utterance is metaphorical, okay? The easiest way to do that is to use Bryce's maxim. You know Bryce, I assume. Okay. So you have various maxims of conversational contributions and so on. And if another instance is uninformative or it's not cooperative,
Right.
if it is inconsistent with what the discourse is and so on.
So
So
again,
if
this,
it's irrelevant,
Yeah.
that would be a reason to take it to be. But
right,
the question is, he has maxims of relevance. The question
yes,
is,
yes.
do they say more about what relevance
There's
consists
a
in?
whole discussion of pragmatics and how this is built into what is suggested. Again, a very sophisticated discussion of this. What do we know about the speaker? What do we know about the intention? What do we know about the context and so on and so on.
So you really have to look at the wider context of each of these
Yes,
passages
yes, yes,
in the poetry.
yes.
Okay, and the third point was that, and maybe this probably explains the shift that you were pointing to between the later examples and the earlier ones, is that there's been sort of increasing work in recognizing that the literal vehicle for the metaphor is at least as informative, as important in understanding the metaphor as, the metaphorical content. In other words, where you block the literal interpretation and you go to something which is similar and so on. I mean, that you have to really, much of the force of the metaphor depends on the way in which, say, the literal words that are used to express that metaphorical content, right, really contribute a perspective on that
Yeah.
metaphorical content.
That's there too. So that's what some of these people call the purpose. So when you use a metaphor, you do it with some kind of purpose of reinforcing or highlighting or driving some point home. And that depends on the term that you use.
The literal vehicle.
Yeah, the vehicle, yeah.
I think we have a question over there. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you touched on this briefly in a prior answer, but my question is there any specific, in the case of Jagannatha specifically, does he ever directly or indirectly reveal why he chose to wage this grammar war? I.e., is his fidelity to one of his 5 categories? What is the impulse for his fidelity?
Yeah, he does.
Is it a center versus the regions issue? Is it a elitism
No,
thing? What is it?
well, that may be indirectly, but what he says is that the system will collapse. And he says, he uses the dam metaphor. And he says, if you open the dam of the old system, so there's a sense of danger and instability that is very explicit in what he says. And Gary and I have written about this in the past. So he's very explicit that he's seeing what Apaya is seeing, but he's worried about the total collapse of the entire edifice of Alankara Shastra and the categorization by what Apaya is doing. He's saying that. He's saying that here too.
I want us to get to Charlie's comments, so I'll just say briefly,
Yeah.
it seems to me.
I don't.
It seems to me that in the case of a prostitute, the meaning of prostitute has changed. It's not just the relations between the,
Yes.
it's the meaning of it has changed.
True.
And I mean, in classical, let's call it a prostitute, nothing could be more relevant than irrelevant. It's the point of the verse.
Right.
But that may no longer be the case. And also, I mean, you several times, you emphasize the fact that, for example, this lotus that has been bitten off by the geese and all that it's really there. In other words, well, what does that mean? It's really there. It's really there in the poetic reality that is entirely imaginative to begin with. So it's as if you have a kind of staggered set of potentially real and unreal events that are differently valorized depending on, I don't know what, the perspective of the reader, the onlooker, the listener, the eavesdropper. It's interesting.
So it's exactly like that. I mean, I gave you just about a quarter of the verses in these two passages. There's so much mind-boggling stuff going on there. People talking to trees, rivers and oceans negotiate things between one another. And what you see is that you get a kind of a reality that is like contingent several layers up.
It's also as if he implanted some little bits of seemingly real things inside
Exactly.
this imaginary
Exactly.
garden. Like,
Yeah. But they're
was
there,
that?
in
Marianne
that
Moore said,
imagined
yeah,
garden, they're
yeah,
there.
yeah,
Or
right,
at least
yeah.
hypothetically.
An imaginary garden with a real toad in it. That's what Marianne Moore said about the book.
How could you have a garden without bees? I mean,
Yeah.
come on.
Okay.
Okay, so let's take a few minutes break and then allow Charlie the spotlight.
Let's say no more than about 7 minutes.
Okay.
Okay.
So that's what we're going to do.
What did you- Yeah, we somehow, that's why we did lunch. As a lunch area, it's a single movement.
Morning.
That's absolutely right.
If you have a suggestion for Doga.
No, the yoga is good, but I don't like the fawn in the next one.
Which is,
Let's use it, it's a whole word.
yeah,
So it kind of picks on this one little bit. And it's actually means with all of them. Like, but the only other suggestion I have, I think we could- there's just one misspelling. The verb past concern I, it should be E-Y-E. E-Y-E-I-N-G.
okay.
Yeah, Doda. It's not
Okay.
too bad.
Yeah, let's see. So
Great.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, not a lot. But the ones that we worked with for the last 14 years.
כן.
כשלוקחים את אותו, כאילו, מה שמעניין אותי וגם לדבר, כשהסיפור הזה של דברים או משהו אחר, הם הולכים, שזה בדרך כלל אומר אותו דבר, או בדיוק ההפך מזה, נגיד במקרה האחרון, אבל עדיין, אתה כאילו מבחינה קוגניטיבית רואה את הדבר הזה, ואחרי שזיהית את זה פעם אחת אצל דנדין, אתה כבר לא צריך, אתה כבר מבין פחות את הדבר. יש איזה אפילוטי כאילו של הדבר הזה, נראה לי, נגיד, אם סמסוקי בשבילך. ואז, כאילו...
השאלה על ההבדל של בין סמסוקי?
לא, אני לא רוצה שתסביר לי למה זה לא סמסוקי. שכאילו, אני קוראת, קוראת דבר כזה, כמו שאני מבינה את סוג הקשר, או מה... דבר שנעשה מאחורי הקלעים, שזה בעצם הקו. ושפתאום יש את השינוי, הוא נותן לזה שם אחר, או שהוא אומר, הדבר הזה הוא בעצם אחר, מה שקורה פה זה בעצם משהו אחר, לא הבנו נכון
הוא לא מסביר את זה עד הסוף, זה הבעיה. הוא לא מסביר את זה בסוף.
אני גם, אוקיי, אז נגיד לו שאני והוא אומר לה, תגידי לי יקירתי, האם את גרועה, שאף בין הדברים, או אין גרועה, כי הוא אומר לה, תגידי לי יקירתי, האם זה שאת גרועה, לא משנה, כאילו זה שהיה,
כן, כי המסגור הזה מאוד חשוב. איך קורה שאת מגיעה מהדבר הראשון לשני? אם יש את הדברים שאת מדברת עליהם.
אבל יש אותם, רק עם צ'יל וגנדי, יש
אז זה הם לא מדברים. זה הם לא מדברים.
לא שאפשר לי עכשיו לפצח. אין להם לימיטס. יש תהליך של... הם לא אמורים כאילו לדעת בהם. תגידי לי, אם הלוטוס, אם הדבורה לא הלוטוס, אין פה בעצם, תגידי לי, מי שקרב,
האסוציאציה קיימת,
אני לא יודעת אם אפשר לראות שזה שונה, כל ההקשרים שלו, אחרת אני לא יודעת מה
There is a chapter called Perceived.
In your class about frigate.
And there are ways to. And there are ways
But when they say 起心, the assumption is they actually see the thing. When they say 起心, the assumption is that you actually see the thing. Often, right? And it's a thing that actually can have a metaphorical connection, like, you know, 习我往矣，杨柳依依，今我来时，that type. Right, or which also you can argue has some sort of metaphorical connection. Yes, it's
No, that's absolutely right. אם היא תרצה ללכת
So you won't be going to America until next spring, right? When you go to Colombia.
This is always the best part. Whenever they get Charlie to make the closing statement, that's when we really find out what we've done.
So you were saying you also studied Hebrew for a while.
When I knew I was going to be here for a year, that I should at least try to speak a little of it. So I tried to work on it, but then it all collapsed when I had to deal with the cable guy. I couldn't understand anything he was saying, so I gave up on it, basically.
That's very challenging, cables. Wow.
I got as far as translating the manual, the operation manual for the kosher oven in the apartment, but that was as far as I could get. And even that, I got stuck on a technical term. Nobody knew what it meant. Even David didn't know what it meant. So finally, Yigal knew what it meant, because from his years in an army tank, he knew that it meant some kind of injection nozzle for putting a little spray of oil.
That's pretty scary, actually thinking that ants are not that.
It's a little scary to think that learning how to field strip a tank would be helpful in a philological enterprise.
Yeah. Huge amount of weight. So much so that when I saw him after this, I did recognize him. I think that's why I didn't recognize him. He lost half his weight or something. I asked him about it. Well, he's fine. He's fine, but I guess. Something he had to do. He started exercising very rigorously.
We're staying until the 19th of June.
Maybe.
We're going to have it tonight.
Yeah, actually,
Almost coming back in the fall for 3 months.
I first 2 years I saw, I was always thinking
I
after he.
probably won't because I want to finish. I mean, I want to do this Tawashan translation in the next 4 or 5 months. I don't want to move.
He's still in Chicago, right?
But if he comes back in the spring, then I may come.
Maybe retiring.
You're not here in the spring.
Did a very beautiful,
Well,
with a piece of bread.
I'll get you to organize something. I can come to Jerusalem.
11 volumes. Beautifully translated. Beautifully translated, the text was up. We also did a good translation of his work, the Road Library, new translation.
Glenn Moore's translation, yeah, it's really good. Yeah, and the whole loop, like the pre-Socratic philosophy.
Also, his edition of that is in the low.
Yeah,
it's like 8 volumes.
11 volumes. That's beginning. I'm just gonna call you back.
And lots of commentary.
So Omer wrote a novel that is somehow related to all this. I mean, the town is not named.
Also,
I sent it to you. He's going to write it in English this summer. He wrote it in English last spring. It's going to be published in January. I think it's going to be this summer. I sent it to you. So my theory is that we all of us eventually go home or come home, whatever you call it.
We have Charlie with us for another half an hour, and
You write about where you come from.
probably know this is a great
One writes about
asset.
where
We don't
one
want
comes
to
from.
waste even a single second more. And Charlie agreed to give us at least some initial thoughts at the end about the end.
You and Gary, you all keep on talking about this asset, which is like, trying to find out, what you're referring to. David is right, and I apologize, but I have to take a bus over to Mount Scopus, so I have to kind of look at the clock and leave at 4:15. And I'm not leaving because when I speak, then I've heard enough, and then I can go. But maybe what I want to do, following what Yigal just did, is when he was talking about prastuta prashamsa, that what I want to try to do is something of prastuta prashamsa, the praise of the relevant of what has been happening in the last few days. So let me begin with a film that really captured my imagination and heart that we saw the other night, I Dream in Another Language. And to say that perhaps one of the things that's been happening to us over the last few days is that as we've been listening to each other, we've all perhaps been dreaming in a number of different languages. And that's affected how we've heard discussions about grammar. So I think that grammar for a linguist is different than grammar for a philologist. And grammar for a philologist is different than grammar for a cultural historian. And grammar for the cultural historian is different than for the philosopher of language. And that we've had people who are linguists, philologists, cultural historians, philosophers of language, all talking about grammar. No, but those of us listening may be dreaming in other languages and taking in things that are relevant to our dreams, and not really just this interacting with what's being said. There's a wonderful book by the medical anthropologist Arthur Kleinman called The Illness Narratives, which is about how doctors listen to patients when they're describing how they became ill. It's very illuminating. Like someone may say, oh, I started to feel sick when I was at the dinner table with my partner, with my husband. And then it was right after we had this argument, and the doctor's not listening to any of that. The doctor's listening to things that the doctor can convert into useful information for what the doctor is pursuing. And that may be a problem for us that we can try to avoid by being a little bit aware, though, or we're listening for certain kinds of things according to the language of the dreams that we're dreaming in. And so we can maybe challenge ourselves to do or ask ourselves, what are the possible interrelations between the various ways of understanding and explaining grammar that we've heard over the last few days? Not just say that they're different ones, but to say something that they can be interrelated in ways that we haven't yet seen. In terms of learning from Appia Dikshita, can we use the theory of one to see new possibilities in another? So that just the idea of things that are established, that we can see different kinds of possibilities with it. The philosopher Stuart Hampshire, in a essay, Commitment and Imagination, something about a book, collected essays on morality and scholarship. He has a line where he says, oh, the significance of a writer, whether a poet or a philosopher or a historian, and that which makes him or her worthy of study now commonly does not reside principally in the conscious intention behind his or her work, but rather in the precise nature, as we can now see it, of the conflicts and imaginative inconsistencies in his or her work. So it may actually be that the grammar wars are not so much between different ways of seeing grammar or even people arguing with each other, but that within the conflicts and imaginative inconsistencies within particular visions of grammar, that having the perspectives of other visions of grammar may say, wait a second, I never thought about that. Wait a second, that I never thought that was a problem. Wait a second, I have no answer for that. One of the things that I think in our discussions have come up over and over are verbs about comparing different perspectives, different areas, kind of interesting verbs of resonating. Resonate is a verb that I happen to love in terms of being a cultural historian, even though colleagues will accuse me of making stuff up whenever I'm talking about something resonates one thing with another. There's another possibility in the light of Hampshire of, how can we see like different visions of grammar interacting with each other, then intersecting with each other, or kind of, is there a possibility of all the different ways of looking at grammar that we could have a whole greater than the sum of the parts that come out of that? And then also to hold out the possibility of what can we learn from not only different perspectives in the present about how to think about grammar, but what we can learn from people in the past who have really powerful visions of understanding grammar. And that's that last one of, how do we not only learn about something, but how can we learn from people, someone like Appia Dikshita or so on, to see possibilities for ourselves that we never imagined before. the things that have been striking to me over the last few days, listening to really wonderful, rich set of presentations, papers, is just how many variables were in play when people started to talk. And what is, really immediately apparent that trying to reduce the variables is not something that is just hard. It's something that's undesirable. That we don't want to reduce them, but just trying to figure out, what are the variables that we're, putting into play. I told Sarah, my aunt, last night that my mother's father was an acrobat. And one of the things he did was juggling. And so maybe what we need to learn how to do is to juggle a lot of variables at the same time. I shared with him that seeing a newspaper review of his performance maybe 100 years ago, where it was said when he started juggling cannonballs, he brought the house down. And so you're going to say, oh, what we need to do is to juggle cannonballs here together. So let me just go through some of the cannonballs besides grammar. One that really stuck in my mind, a very useful reminder that Eleanor gave us the other day, was that, reminding us grammars don't make war, persons make war. And I just say I've had a perpetual discomfort with the metaphor the whole time, but the idea that we're talking about both grammar and grammarians, we're talking about persons as well as whatever we take grammar to be, I think is a really important thing. It's the kind of thing that for the cultural historian, the philologist, immediately is always present, I think. And then the interesting question that Eleanor put to us about what does expertise look like when we're talking about the expertise of a grammarian. One possibility was that, the expertise is a technique, so that it's something in public that anyone can learn, and that's the technique. But listening to Glenn's presentation this morning on the analogy in the Cratylus of the carpenter making the shuttle for the weaver, it struck me that the skill of the carpenter is not a techne, it's a metis, that it belongs to the person in a certain way. And so what we have in one way of understanding what's going on with grammar is something that is a techne, but good grammarians have something else that we want to maybe investigate as a metis. I found the image from the Cratylus that I didn't know at all, that good weaving depends on having good carpenters. And so then you just say, grammarians may be something like carpenters for people doing other kinds of things. And knowing how to create a shuttle for different kinds of weaving, linen or wool or whatever, that is a kind of skill that belongs to the person in some ways. Other thoughts about grammarians? Reminded of a great poem that was translated by Narayana Rao and David Shulman. That's the title, Grammar School. So let me just read, I'll change one word, even though I don't know the language translated, but not knowing the language and translating has never stopped me before, so why get fussy now? They taught me it was neuter, so I sent my mind to my girlfriend. Now it's making love to her and won't come back. Now, never trust a grammarian or never trust a linguist, as their translation, right? So this is one really important thing.
What, never to trust the grammarian?
Yeah, that's right. Never trust the grammarian. And some of the grammarians that we've been hearing, they may be trustworthy, but I would also say that they're insufferable too. That they are rude, obnoxious, nitpicking, and so on. But just trying to figure out what makes a good grammarian. And is what the grammarian produces best understood as a technique. or is it best understood as something of a metis? And that the good grammarians that we end up studying in cultural, history, philology, they may have something that's on both sides. Another thing that kept on coming to my mind of, grammar and language. And different ways of thinking about this. So this is where like thinking about grammar seemed to morph into something about a philosophy of language. What's the relationship of language to the world? So grammar and language is about language and reality. It's about language and language. And it's about language and the brain. Let me just point out one of the things about that we had that was really quite striking of the language and reality. We didn't thematize too much, even though it was present a lot, of those intellectual traditions that think that language is not capable of giving adequate accounts of the reality of the world. We saw one place where the translation that Andrew gave us of the Japanese version of trying to struggle with compounds and so on, in which it kept on using the phrase in a worldly sense, which I just put into a Buddhist philosophy of religion, that certain kinds of language work in a worldly sense. They're conventionally true, but when it comes to describing reality, they're completely false. And we had something like that too, that I shared with David. And it makes no sense for me to say that a bunch of superstrings is looking at another bunch of superstrings. You say a person is looking at a person. And so we have other ways of describing reality that doesn't match into the grammar that we talk about, how language works. The stuff on how to talk about language and language of the system of this came up in things about the karakas. That can we get deeper and deeper abstractions about language? There's one other thing that I thought about this morning with the discussion in the Cratylus about how names work. There's a wonderful story in the Buddhist world, the Jaundice Story, about a person whose name literally means a bunch of sin, or having sin, or just sin, and he gets tired of people like saying to him, "Come over here, sin. Go over there, sin." And so he goes to the Buddha and says, "Can I have another name?" And the Buddha says, "Sure, just go out in the world and find one." And so he goes out and he sees this funeral. And he asked some people, who were watching, and said, "Who died?" And the answer is Quick. And he says, "Can Quick be dead?" And the person says, "A name's only to tell who's who. You seem to be a fool." And so that's one of the things that he goes around, he sees a slave being beaten, and he asks, "Who's that person?" And it says, "Free." And he says, "Can free be a slave?" And the same answer, "A name's only to tell who's who. You seem to be a fool." And so that kind of issue about, we're thinking about the language and reality. One of the most striking observations that for me over the last few days is almost all of our discussions have focused on a couple of interesting details that if we were just thinking about grammar and linguists, I don't think would be in play so much. So one was, David pointed out on the first day that our discussions are all in cultural scenes, historical scenes in which multiple languages are in play. And that seems to be like kind of significant, that there's some issue of the co-presence of different languages. Then some significance about literature, that the grammar that we're interested in is literary languages, that a grammar of Homer, a grammar of the Hebrew Bible, and then also, Anomalai kind of brought this out, grammar and writing. That it seems, there's a surprising connection between these three things. It's not that there's a language here that just is used, but grammar seems to go with those three things. Then the other kind of variable, it was hard to kind of control, but more cannonballs, is grammar and contiguous language sciences, phonology, lexicography, poetics, hermeneutics. And then one that I'm not sure I got my mind around, but I fell in love with it. So, and I'm looking at Joseph because it's something, the semantics of consignificance. And so I just said, oh, I don't know what that is, but I like it. So, but that seems to be like another whole field, and just what lots of the study of grammar that we've been focusing on. I think the term that Joseph used in his talk about from Hebrew, the seguro, I think is like a really valuable theoretical concept that, you know, what we're looking at are the consignificance of grammar quite a lot, not just the primary necessities of grammar, but something else that's there. Then last would be grammar and things that might be cannibals, things that are kind of far away. Some of it is because we're looking at things that are in ritual, in religion, things about ritual. Wai's discussion this morning about spiritual affinity and carnal desire coming together. You know, that you say, oh, what kind of grammar is allowing us to see some closeness between them? But just the larger kind of area of these other variables that keep on. It's as if on the foolish analogy of juggling, someone keeps on throwing another ball and that you're like moving faster and faster trying to keep it. So the final thing I just want to say is that for me, the benefit of the last few days together, in addition to just being fascinated by what everyone was saying, is that it became clear to me is that grammar is not only a good thing to think with, it's a particularly good thing to think about. And so just trying to figure out what is it that this phenomenon is doing when it enters into a sphere of human thinking and activity. It's something that I would say I don't have any kind of ready answer for, simply because of my own lack of imagination. Thing, well, grammar is just something you use to think about stuff. It's not something that's so good to kind of. It's just something you use to think with. You know, you don't have. It's just a tool. But then you say, no, it's a really interesting thing to think about. So, I have to thank all of everyone else. And Gary can still say, God, that was a disappointment.
I would like to see the judgment.
Cannonball with one end or two?
Now, in terms of the contiguous language sciences, punning is like a really important one and stuff. So
Next summer.
that's right. So it's a form of extreme thinking. So I killed conversation.
Are you sure if everything that was interesting happened when different languages met each other? I mean, I know we've been arguing about the definition of language, but I thought some of the interesting things that happened within a single variety of language. So
Yeah.
even if you're not gonna sort of argue about the definition of language, the grammar can be interesting within one very prescribed variety.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right. But we did see a lot of cases where there was some kind of interaction with another language or language system or several languages and so on. It was surprising to me. I just noticed it in the course of listening to people that there was very often a kind of multilingual environment. And even if it was within a single language, Usually it's a language which has diglossia or multiglossia of one kind or another, so that there's like some internal.
Yes, but most languages do.
Yeah, maybe all languages do. Diglossia of one kind or another. Right. But I don't think all languages theorize them in the same way or to the same extent. In Telugu, for example, take a example close to my heart. They believe they had a war. They had something that they called the war of the language in the early 20th century because the diglossia was so extreme that that just to write like for example in a newspaper or something like that was like a tremendous challenge, and it broke down, and they then created this what they now call modern standard Telugu. And so they will tell you, Telugu speakers, that they have solved the diglossia problem, which is everywhere else in India. But I can tell you from experience in Andhra that it's not true. It's just as diglossic as ever. It's just that they now have another speech register, which is available to them for expressive purposes at one time or another. It's an illusion to think that they've actually solved it.
Yeah, there's an article by Nancy Jordan, who studied Spanish Gaelic on a very small island, register variation in a language that you can find for private school use.
Yeah.
And the theory was that here is where you would find that there is no variation, right? Because it's very small group of people, and they can only use this language in informal situations because nobody else knows it.
Yeah.
And in fact, she found considerable register variation.
Yeah.
You could also say that diglossia has been important even in instances where it didn't exist. What I mean is, you could explain Sanskrit grammar as having come about, not because of a difference between Sanskrit and Middle Indic, but because of a perceived difference between the language that was being spoken by people like Panini and the language of the Veda, which they were afraid would disappear.
It might be that we have separate categories of a difference of diglossia than we have for multiple languages in one place, and then for historical change. But and we keep those things separate. We may just say, well, is there a good reason, conceptually, to keep them separate? And that, I'm not sure I want to generalize the last few days for the truth of all language for all time and all places. But just over the last 2 days, it's just been a striking feature of presentations of something about multiplicity always being present.
I think we reserve the term diglossia for a much more specific situation, not simply a couple of different registers and different choices of language level and things like that people can use, but a very specific situation, which is a classical language and non-spoken language. I think we have to reserve it for that. Otherwise, it means anytime there's a multilingual context for anybody.
What about modern standard Arabic? Or is that not a?
Yes,
not
it
a-
is.
But it's not a classic language, but the modern standard Arabic as a different register from the classic Arabic.
Right,
So
but in
you wouldn't say that's.
literary world, they have classical expressions and right, and things like that. Yeah.
I don't know if just somebody who sometimes speaks Indian language or two. I mean, diglossia is like the continuous and constant linguistic reality that is one's negotiating all the time.
That's in the broad sense, but I'm using it now.
Yeah.
There's a couple of registers for these people in the Scottish Island. Is it really?
Well, that's a couple of registers within a diagnostic situation, of course, because this is a language that's being killed off by it. So they had diagnostic, they had English versus Scottish Gaelic. And what was interesting was that within each of those diagnostic registers, they had further registers.
So I wouldn't use diagnostic for a case where it's very simple.
So let's talk not about diglossia. Let's not argue about this. Let's talk. I mean, in India, the situation is usually what Paulo calls hyperglossia,
Yeah.
where you have different languages, some of them universal, some of them local. Each of them is spoken differently depending on the community and depending on gender and depending on social context. And there's a bunch of them at every given moment, and you keep making choices. So that's, I think, that for scholars of India, I think that's the, of course, for people from India, that's the basic reality. I want to bring another ball into the juggling here, which is the theories. So you spoke about, Charlie, about so this question of theory of language use as mitigated by language theory. That is to say, each person is a grammarian. Nobody's to be trusted. Each person is a grammarian, and everything that we say about language is a theory. Metaphor is a theory. Words are theory. Language names are theory. So when we speak, okay, so what you are understood by other people as doing is not always the same as what you think you're doing. For example, I had an experience with a taxi driver with whom I spoke, I thought was Hindi, and he commented on the quality of my Urdu. Okay, so falsely positively. You know that there is a rule. If you say the first 4 words, oh, you know the whole of Urdu, he said. But then when you start talking, so yeah, so exactly. So I was thinking of speaking, I was speaking Hindi, but so people, what they think they're doing, if they think they're using inflection like this or like that, a word, a metaphor, a compound, a samasa, that no, let's put it this way, no language use is free from grammatical consciousness in some broad sense of the word. And so I don't know what that means, but that's something.
Just add one thing that I'll recall. The things that Eitan introduced into when I was listening was, that he clearly was listening for things. What can be generalized?
Right.
And when you say, well, every person is a grammarian, that's generalizable. I'm not sure it's a generalization that you would want to take. But what's interesting,
He would agree. I asked him that.
okay. But one of the things that he had in his presentation was that the people talking about language contact, the theories have changed because people are generalizing from like the way that someone who knows multiple languages is choosing and using languages. That it's not a contact between a closed system with another closed system and they somehow intersect, but that there's something that you're always assuming, like this kind of unbounded multiplicity that is part of the operation. That is kind of very large, what I would call Mars eye view of language spread change, was generalizing from something that was very, very particular of the psychology of individual speakers. That was a very, very suggestive way in which, say, traveling theory like that. And one last just thing on the film that I just was, it was an interesting comment of, I forget her name, the young woman with the 2 men, where one man only spoke Zicril, the other man both spoke Zicril, and she said, how can you talk about love if you don't know Spanish?
Yeah.
But then when Uvira was talking to, I forget the linguist's name, Martine, that's right. And she was talking about, she said, I teached. And he said, I think you should say, I taught, and which you could see, oh, that the correction was the language of love. And in that, instead, what it held out the possibility that conflicts in grammar don't, is exactly your point. Like you could, is it Urdu, is it Hindi, is it war, is it love? And someone could say, oh, I'm defensive, I don't like being corrected. But in the scene, it was a beautiful scene, and it was very clear when he said, I think you should say, I taught, when she has said, I teached, which is, the generalizable rule. And
He also said, I love you for the first, I love her for the first time in Spanish when she was under the bed.
That's right. Yeah.
But the opposite of what you just said, of generalization, is particularization.
Yeah.
So you could go to the extreme of saying that each person speaks a different language. No two people speak the same language. That each idiolect is a little bit different.
That's right.
Yeah.
You could go another language, saying no one person speaks the same language today as they did yesterday.
That's right.
I would definitely go that.
I turn.
You and I have to come across oceans and oceans to
Come
only
to
way to see
Jerusalem
each other
to-
in Cambridge
I
is
know.
across oceans.
And he's up the
See
street.
you later.
So, but one thing continues to puzzle me, okay, and please enlighten me. So what happens when in fact you don't have commensurate grammatical categories? In other words, what everything we've been talking about, whether it's cases, inflection, tenses, classifying parts of speech and so on. What if some languages just, I mean, in this case, Chinese, totally doesn't deal with it at all?
Then they produce great literature.
Well, but and then they wrote, things that fill libraries and so on. But if we were to listen to the colleague from yesterday, right? So finally, in 1898, someone under the influence of all the missionaries produced a Chinese grammar. In 1898, the year of the 100 Days Reform, precisely at the moment when people not exactly stop, but when there's a transition to another kind of language. So, and that is the exact opposite of what David talked about a couple of days ago, right? When you think of grammar as the birth of poetry and the great enabling act that allows everything else to come into being.
That's the emic notion in South India.
Right. So, yeah, I don't know.
Because there's also another driving force that is translation.
Mhm.
The missionaries could also not have written grammars, but they did because they needed to translate. And not only the Bible, but especially the Catholic missionary had to translate their prayers, their rituals. And it had to be done correctly. So their first attempt at generalizing European grammar categories to Chinese was motivated by translation. How can I translate for the best this passage, this expression? And like in one of those grammar, which incidentally is the one I have written my PhD thesis on, the one by Yasin Bichurin, the Russian one, he says an interesting thing. He says, Chinese do have inflection, but this inflection is not in the form, but is in the mind, mental inflection. Of course, who needs to mentally inflect words? It's not the Chinese. Is the Russian translator.
I was going to say the same thing. It's not that it's not there. It's a fault.
Yeah.
That's marked, and it's certainly intuitive in understanding the patterns.
Why is it better to say that Chinese grammar is mostly like word order and this is the main
But what I'm saying is, but it's not identified as an issue one talks about, right? Because there are tons of writings on poetics and how to write, but never in any terms that's even vaguely resembling what we're talking about, right? They would talk about style and.
But that writing on poetics, from the little I know, often makes conscious manipulation precisely of the unmarked nature of the Chinese grammar. So the fact that that words are monosyllabic and the fact that they can sometimes be a noun and sometimes a verb is used to create polysemy in a conscious way. So that is a kind of poetic grammar that takes into consideration the particularities of the unmarked grammar of the Chinese language. It's people are conscious of that. And from the stuff that translations that I read from certain poetic books, I can't read Chinese, that they knew what they were doing with that grammar. They knew what the subject and an object and a verb were, and they played with that.
I was thinking over the last few days about the absence of grammar culture. So there is no grammar. I don't want to enter the Chinese debate, although I think I have a position on it. But you know, I mean, or why grammar might appear relatively late over a long historical continuum in Hebrew, for example, like before and his predecessors in Spain. And so on. Java is a great example. Java is one of the world's great literatures, amazingly richly elaborated literary culture, and there's no grammar at all, no book of grammar. There's somewhere in the background, Sanskrit grammar is kind of hovering in the minds of whoever had a Sanskrit education there, which I guess is most of the poets, but we have no grammar book. So how does one learn actually old Japanese grammar? Daniel can tell you. You learn by reading rather a lot of it, and then inductively producing a set of rules. That's how the modern grammar is.
That's probably the normal situation.
Yeah, well, children actually. That's how children
Well, the abnormal thing is producing these matters.
But when you think about when did people start to teach grammar of modern languages, as one of the scholars was saying the other day, it's Latin grammar that's being taught, right?
Yeah.
Everybody else was producing all these other.
Europe and in the European sphere of influence, you could say.
I think it has to do with when people are having problems with the modern language. Because I mean, if you're a speaker of Anglo-Saxon, you grow up speaking Anglo-Saxon, you don't have a problem with Anglo-Saxon. It's Latin you have a problem with.
Yeah.
You need a Latin grammar.
Well-
And in England, it certainly happens when you have issues with French. You have people who need to know French and they don't know French. And that's when you need a French grammar. The earliest French grammars are from England because people in France didn't need it.
But this is going back to the translation question you talked about.
Also, everyone uses the word grammar, but it means different things.
Yes.
That's what I wanted
And
to
I mean, I think India is an extreme example of where, as David said, the grammar, the Haranam, it's mostly morphology, was the basic paradigmatic scientific text that all the later scholars always, I mean, it's a paradigmatic scientific model for all other sciences.
By India, you
Yeah.
mean Sanskrit.
Hmm?
By India, you mean Sanskrit.
Yeah, I mean Sanskrit.
But
I
like
mean,
in Java, yeah, it depends how you define grammar, because grammar is, I don't know, it's some way to theorize language. So it's true, we don't have it in Java, but we do have it because we do have a theory of what they find important in language. So we have so many treatises speaking about the magical powers and qualities of different syllables. So they do theorize language, but the frameworks.
That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah. So you can have reflections of language in many different forms, but totally incommensurate with the kind of grammatical categories that 80% of the time we've been talking about.
Yeah.
Simple point, question of information. In modern India, in cities, let's say, when they're teaching Sanskrit, do they impose on it, world terminology, or do they stick to classical terminology?
First of all, they don't teach it very often anymore.
No, but if they do.
No, they use the traditional categories, I would say.
Even for a kid,
Yeah, you would learn.
Sanskrit or Panini. It depends which city or in which tradition they follow. Some would learn Paninian terms, and some people would learn, say, Bhandara. If it's Pune school children would be learning Bhandara's terms, and they are introduced to Paninian terms when they go for their undergraduate or masters in Sanskrit.
But the terms of planning is so impossible to grasp for anyone who's not.
I had an experience once, my student heard me tell this, I was talking to the Sanskrit department at University of Andhra University, and they had these Sanskritists in the room, and they were very curious to know how we teach Sanskrit in Jerusalem. So I explained how we do it. We have a textbook, we teach them grammar, and we aim to, by the end of the first year, they're going to be able to work independently with the grammars and the dictionaries, and they can start reading and all, you know. So then the audience in the room, these are Sanskrit scholars, they split into two groups. They were like the young Turks. They said, oh gosh, what an idea. You're going to actually set them free. You won't have to be responsible for them after a single year. And then the conservative scholars said, you can't learn Sanskrit like that. You have to spend maybe 4 or 5 or 6 years learning by heart the Paninian sutras without understanding anything of them, and then you can begin to study grammar.
Wasn't it 12 years in the story?
Yeah, it is. Right. Yeah.
6 years on discount, yeah.
I'll add something to what you were saying. Perhaps there's an analogy in all of those crafts where you see sometimes theory when you don't, and you see the practice. So if you take the study of classical music in India, now for at least 500 years, we find musicological texts, and we can kind of more or less trace the musical practice of the last 500 years. And there's very little connection between those texts and the practice. If you wanted to learn classical music, you went and apprenticed yourself to a teacher, who was often also an instrument maker or a player. And you learn to produce music, and you learn the pre-composed pieces, but you also learned improvisation inductively. Your teacher did not use any technical terms. They did not teach you a theory of how to improvise. Nonetheless, with luck, you either turned into a reasonable performer or a virtuoso. And there's no grammar of music. There's perhaps lists of modes saying what notes they take and what they don't take. But what you see is that there is this kind of practice where there's a community of people who produce and consume it, and they're able to inherit this skill. And if language is this kind of competence, if it's a kind of skill, then it's like this. You haven't questioned why you didn't write grammars, why you didn't develop a new terminology and describe processes that came to morphology and syntax in this practice. Perhaps it's the same in China.
But there's also the distinction between using grammar as a tool of analysis than learning the grammar in order to reproduce, to have the skill to create in that language, right? So I don't know whether people, when they were studying Latin, they were actually trying to write in Latin in a lot of cases, right?
Well, some people were and some people weren't. Some people just wanted to read it.
Right.
Some people wanted to produce it. And to this day, you have that split, and there are two groups.
Right. Whereas I would say, let's say for vast majority of people who were trying to write in classical Chinese, in earlier times, they weren't studying grammar, they were trying to just write in classical Chinese. Whereas let's say if we do it now and we approach it with a lot of grammatical categories, it's in part because we're just trying to parse it. We are not trying to write it anymore. Maybe, I don't know. I mean, after all those arguments come up in scholarly communities, right? It's not as if people writing it were actually paying attention.
Like in Chicago, we have to learn how to just read but not reproduce French or German in a 9-week quarter, but your test will be 7th week.
Yeah.
And so there's especially they're doing grammar in a specific way, just so that we can translate a scholarly article with just a physical dictionary. So that's another way of just having a very specialized grammar.
We did that too, and none of it sticks.
Don't say that.
It's a requirement.
If you satisfy the requirement after the course. Yeah.
May I throw in a thought just what we had this morning, reading the calculus. He said there's something beautiful line, like he talks about the normal status. There it's translated as it's actually a lawgiver, but there it's translated as a name maker. And I think it was interesting what is said about him or her is the kind of craftsman most rarely found among human beings. And so we're all here talking about the endangered species, more or less. So, and I think that's also a question about authority, like who can have this, you know.
Yeah.
But it's almost the opposite argument in Sanskrit grammar. Right? You, in Sanskrit grammar, they say, you don't, like the way you need a pot and you go to the potter and you ask that potter, make me a pot. You don't go to the linguist when you need a word and say, make me a word.
Right.
So it's the same analogy that we saw this morning, where turn the other way around here. Right?
Joe was trying to say something.
You know, I don't know whether to say anything or not. I have so many things in my tiny little brain at war. But I think it's, my feeling is that every language has a grammar. So if we say, you know, a structure, let's say, and that is unique in every person as well. Whether a document or a work exists is a separate question. From the fact that we're using language intuitively perhaps, but according to certain conventions that allow us to be understood. The other thing that I am always uneasy about is, and Eleanor touched on this, is the use of, when grammar gets normative, as it often does, how that interacts with hierarchy and social divisions, and how it's used sometimes to enforce hierarchy. So we didn't talk much about that. I don't want to end on a sour note, but I think that if we think about the sociolinguistic pieces of it, that comes up for sure. But I think Chinese is grammar.
No, please, I don't mean, of course, if we understand by grammar just rules of composition or ways of making language work or making it beautiful, then of course it has a grammar. All I'm saying is that the categories we're analyzing it are so very different from the kind of things we're talking about.
That's what's so interesting.
Haskell math was name checked a couple of times, and so I'm going to go to some of those texts on typology to see what they're doing to generalize categories to allow comparison across very different syntactical strategies.
But it could be things besides syntax, right?
Sure.
I'm thinking of when Charlie, a lot of hyper quoting, but Charlie mentioned an article that Gary has written about Abhinav quoting Vamana. About the right combinations of syllables and what happens when syllables are put together. And this sounds like a grammar of taste. And it's not the grammars of syntax.
Yeah, I think Chinese is maybe kind of ending up looking more of an outlier here than it really is.
Yes.
I mean, the Latin, the Greek, and the Sanskrit, they are all Indo-European. They are really similar to each other in how their grammar works.
Yeah.
And okay, we had a little bit of, you know, Hebrew and Akkadian, but that's also not dissimilar. But if we had a completely representative set of languages in this room, I think Indo-European would have been a much smaller percentage, and then Chinese wouldn't look so weird.
But I talked about this with Eitan over dinner last night, and he told me that from the language family to which Chinese belongs, when you deduce the kind of proto-language, it was highly inflectional, and that it just somehow, in the case of Chinese, lost all of these inflections, lost the morphology. So that's a fascinating thing to the extent to which it ended up being, but that inflectionality is not so unusual and not just associated with the Semitic and the Indo-European languages. And some of the languages in the family of Chinese, and there are all kinds of arguments exactly how to call it and what it includes, and I'm not an expert on this by any means, but some of them are still very full of inflection. So.
If I may, it's also about Chinese, that's is a theory. Probably they have some grasp, some evidence of this
languages.
But actually speaking, like English
But it's so
itself
different.
is way less inflected than
Yes.
Italian,
Yes.
let alone Latin or Greek. And if we go to the Creole languages, I think they're really fascinating because they, in many cases, totally lack any inflection. Like English Creoles, they lack any S, plural S, the third person S, nothing of that. So it's very interesting, I think.
And that may have a strong impact on language use. Andrew Wallet has given some interesting talks recently, trying to show that the loss of inflections in Upper Brahmsha and in Middle Indic, that eventually produced so much ambiguity that it caused a return to Sanskrit in circles that had not used it for centuries. And that presumably, I can't say anything about it because I don't know about it, but there were probably, is that part of the parallel in European languages, that Latin came into use in places where it hadn't been used for a while because Italian and French became ambiguous in ways that,
No, I don't think.
you don't think so?
But there was like a reform in studying that.
Yes, I think people have wanted to learn Latin and wanted to fool around with doing Latin in different ways throughout history, but I don't think the particular thing that you're describing has been a significant motivation.
Yeah, I wondered about that. I think what he was describing was really a gap between the point where inflections had been lost to the point of ambiguity and the remedy for that through the sort of importation of postpositions and prepositions that we heard about, which is what happens, in languages like Hindi, that what used to be case endings are replaced by postpositions.
But the example of Chinese shows that anytime there is ambiguity, you can just remedy that with a particle or something. You don't have to, you don't have to reconstitute the whole system.
Yeah,
You just add a little word which makes it clear what tense it is.
But in the case of
But the problem is, can you reconstitute it in a way that speakers of all the neighboring languages can also understand? That was the situation in India.
Also, Prakrit in Sanskrit, you had a particular language register, Sanskrit, as it's called, which was enormously prestigious, and that was available to somebody who was feeling that couldn't express himself with precision in Prakrit because of the ambiguity.
But I think any language can inherently solve any ambiguity problem in a language internal way. It's true that that might not be comprehensible to the neighbors, but being comprehensible to the neighbors is often not people's number one interest.
But it's one interest. And so that was the situation with Upper Brahmsha, that everyone could understand it up until the time when none of them could.
Just in relation to the today morning's speech on words and their meanings. So there is one discussion in commentary of Tonkapiyam, and the aphorism itself is very interesting because that says all words denote meaning. So, but the interesting thing is that the commentators discuss about their giving example of two examples. One is rabbit horn. Is there a reality? There is no rabbit horn in this. But the other example they give is blanket of turtle's hair. There is no turtle hair, so you cannot make a blanket out of it. But you can make a word. So how real are these things? So the commentators come up with the answer like single words. Single words are real. You cannot conceptualize a word which is not real. A single word, if it is single. But when the words join together, they become compound or phrase. That is only when the language enters into non-reality. So when the word is single, that is always a connection with reality. So that's very interesting because the words, how the words enter into reality, how the words enter into non-reality. The discussion happened.
Friends, I think we're going to have to stop. I think it can speak for both of us. It's been a wonderful few days. It's just been really wonderful. Wonderful getting to meet people whom we haven't met before, and wonderful to be with friends from the, from the past. And lovely discussions, good food, and we really owe a vote of thanks to the Institute. It's too bad that it's not here now this afternoon, because although we strenuously tried to persuade her to come in and allow us to thank her, she kept saying that she didn't need to hear our thanks. And she didn't want all of that. But we'll make sure to write the Institute a note, of course, and thank.
And then we'll actually send you some feedback forms, so let them know if they can improve things, change things, what you like.
And thanks to all of you for coming.
Yeah.
Really great.
It's not taken for granted that people travel for conferences these days or for schools. Also travel safely.
Stay in touch, please.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.